I still remember the first time I stood on that land. There was no noise, no traffic, no voices, just wind moving through open space, the kind of quiet that makes you breathe slower without realizing it. That was the moment I thought, this is it. This is what freedom feels like. I didn't buy that property to get rich. I didn't buy it to flip it. I bought it because I wanted something simple, land that belonged to me, where no one could tell me how to live. And the best part? It was outside the HOA, not inside, not governed by it, not subject to its rules, fees, or meetings. The HOA neighborhood sat nearby, neat and organized like a brochure. Same style houses, trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes. I respected it from a distance, but I didn't want to be part of it. I wanted space, privacy, control. On paper, everything looked perfect. In reality, there was one problem I hadn't fully understood yet. There was no proper road. Not a real one, anyway. There was a narrow dirt path that people had been using for years. It wasn't official. It wasn't maintained. It was just there. In dry weather, it filled the air with dust. In the rain, it turned into thick mud that grabbed your tires and refused to let go. The first time I drove down it after buying the land, I thought, okay, this is rough but manageable. The second time I realized it wasn't. Every bump rattled the truck. Every dip felt like a warning. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was unreliable. And unreliable access turns land into a liability fast. That's when I understood something important. Owning land doesn't mean much if you can't reach it properly. So I started looking at options. And very quickly, those options turned into a choice that would change everything. I could use the HOA's internal roads. They were paved, clean, well-maintained. They connected directly to the main road. On the surface, it seemed like the obvious solution. But nothing with an HOA is ever just about convenience. Using their roads meant asking permission, signing agreements, accepting conditions, paying fees. And once you do that, you're no longer fully independent. You're tied in. Even if you're not officially a member, you're still under their influence. The other option was harder. Build my own road, on my land, with my money, under my responsibility. It would cost more upfront. It would take time. It would be work. No one would help. No one would thank me. But it would be clean. No strings, no assumptions, no future leverage. People told me I was being stubborn. Why spend all that money when the HOA road is right there? You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just work something out with them. But I've learned something over the years. The things that seem easiest at the beginning often cost the most later. I didn't want favors. I didn't want exceptions. I didn't want to owe anyone anything. So I committed to the hard option. I did everything by the book. I hired professional surveyors to mark the exact property boundaries. Not guesses. Not approximations. Exact lines. I wanted zero ambiguity. I went to the county and pulled permits. I talked to inspectors. I made sure drainage wouldn't affect neighboring properties. I checked setbacks. I followed regulations most people don't even know exist. This wasn't just about building a road. It was about protecting myself. When construction finally started, it felt surreal. Heavy equipment rolled in. Dirt was cut and shaped. Gravel was layered and compacted. Day by day, something solid replaced something uncertain. I watched it happen from the edge of the property, thinking about how long that land had been there without a proper path. And now, slowly, it was changing. When the road was finished, it didn't look fancy, but it looked right, strong, straight, reliable. It was mine. The first time I drove on it, I didn't rush. I rolled slowly, listening, feeling the surface under the tires. No slipping, no sinking, no second-guessing. For the first time since buying the land, access wasn't a question anymore. I remember standing at the end of that road one evening, watching the sun drop low, feeling something I hadn't expected. Relief. I thought the hard part was over. I thought the problem was solved. I was wrong. A few weeks later, I opened my mailbox and saw a clean white envelope with a familiar logo. The HOA's logo. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a notice about nearby construction or neighborhood updates. I almost tossed it aside without opening it. Almost. Inside was a letter. Short, professional, polite, and right there in the middle of the page was a number that made me stop breathing for a second. $300. The letter said it was an access and maintenance fee. I read it again, then again. I actually laughed, out loud, because I wasn't using their roads. I had just spent a small fortune building my own. So I set the letter down and shook my head. This has to be a mistake, I said to myself. I had no idea that this little piece of paper was about to turn my quiet purchase of land into something very different. Something much bigger and much uglier. At first, I honestly thought that first HOA letter was just a mistake. A computer glitch. A checkbox marked wrong. Some intern clicking the wrong address. So I did what most normal people would do. I ignored it. I didn't call. I didn't email. I didn't panic. I had built my own road, on my own land, using my own money. There was nothing to argue about. At least that's what logic said. But HOAs don't run on logic. They run on routine. And routine expects compliance. About a month later, I opened my mailbox again and saw the same logo, same envelope, same return address, different energy. This letter felt heavier before I even opened it. And when I did, I knew immediately this wasn't a reminder. It was a warning. The tone was sharper, shorter, more confident. It talked about outstanding balance. It mentioned late fees. It included a deadline. This wasn't a suggestion anymore. This was pressure. The letter said my property benefited from HOA infrastructure and was therefore subject to an access and maintenance fee. That sentence stuck with me. Not uses, not accesses, not travels on, benefits from. It was vague on purpose, flexible, designed to stretch just enough to cover whatever they wanted it to cover. I sat there holding the letter, and something clicked. This wasn't about roads. This was about assumption. HOAs survive because most people don't question them. They pay because arguing feels exhausting. They comply because the paperwork looks official enough to be scary. And for a moment, I understood why this tactic works. Because even when you know you're right, doubt sneaks in. I caught myself thinking, what if I'm missing something? What if there's some rule buried deep in their bylaws? What if fighting this costs more than paying it? That's the psychological game. Make the number small enough to seem easier than resistance. $300 isn't life-changing. It's not a lawsuit. It's not a foreclosure notice. It's just annoying. And annoyance makes people give up. But the more I thought about it, the more something bothered me. If I paid this fee once, it wouldn't stop there. Next year, it would be another fee. Then an increase. Then special assessments. Then conditions. And suddenly, I'd be tied to an HOA I never agreed to join. That's when I decided I wasn't ignoring this anymore. But I also wasn't going to attack. Anger gives them something to point at. Calm forces them to respond. So I wrote back. The email was simple, clear, respectful. I explained that my property was not part of the HOA, that I had built a private road entirely on my own land, that I did not use HOA roads for access. I attached documentation, property surveys showing boundaries, photos of the road under construction, permit approvals from the county. I didn't accuse them of wrongdoing. I didn't threaten. I didn't argue. I just stated facts. And I ended with one sentence. Please review the attached documents and confirm that this invoice has been issued in error. I hit send and felt confident. Facts don't lose. Or so I thought. Their response came 2 days later. 2 days. That was the first red flag. Because there was no way they had reviewed everything I sent that fast. Surveys alone take time to understand if you actually care about accuracy. This response didn't feel reviewed. Felt pre-written. They thanked me for my message. They acknowledged receipt of my documents. And then they rejected everything. The letter said that access was assumed based on proximity. That my property still benefited from community infrastructure. That fees were standard practice. And then I read the sentence that made my stomach tighten. Payment is mandatory. Mandatory. That one word changed the entire situation. Mandatory means authority. Authority means legal backing. And if they were wrong about that, they were stepping into dangerous territory. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was a power move. They weren't asking if they were right. They were telling me they were. And that's when I stopped thinking like a homeowner and started thinking like someone who needed to protect himself. I didn't respond. Instead, I started digging. I pulled up county property records. I searched for recorded easements. I read through HOA bylaws and state property laws. I wasn't looking for loopholes. I was looking for truth. And the deeper I went, the clearer something became. The HOA was very confident. But confidence doesn't create rights. Documents do. And I was starting to realize that there might be something they were counting on me never checking. Something that, if exposed, could flip this entire situation upside down. Because if they didn't have legal authority to charge me, then that meant something else. It meant they might be relying on access they never actually owned. And if that was true, then this wasn't about me owing them money. This was about them owing me answers. I kept reading, late into the night, and somewhere between zoning maps and easement law, I felt that shift again. That quiet shift. The moment when you realize the ground under someone else's confidence is thinner than they think. And that's when I found it. Or rather, that's when I realized what wasn't there. That night I didn't sleep much. Not because I was angry, but because my mind wouldn't slow down. Every time I closed my eyes, that word came back. Mandatory. Kept echoing in my head like a dare. So instead of lying in bed, I sat at my desk with a laptop, a cup of coffee, and one simple goal. Find out what they were counting on me not knowing. I started with the obvious stuff. County property records, deeds, plat maps, the boring documents most people never read unless they absolutely have to. First, everything looked normal. My property lines were exactly where I thought they were. Clear, clean, undisputed. The HOA's boundary stopped well short of my land. So I went deeper. I searched for easements. An easement is basically a legal permission slip. It's what allows someone to use land they don't own. Roads, utilities, walkways, none of that works legally without one. If the HOA had the right to charge me for access, there had to be an easement somewhere. I searched the county database. Nothing. I searched again using different keywords, different dates, different parcel numbers. Still nothing. At first, I thought maybe I was missing something. Maybe it was filed under an older record or bundled into a larger agreement. So I went even further back. Years, then decades. And that's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. There was no easement. Not recorded. Not implied. Not hidden. It simply didn't exist. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. Because if there was no easement, then legally the HOA had no right to use my land. And that's when a second realization hit me. For years, HOA residents had been using a small section of my property as a shortcut. It wasn't official. It wasn't paved. Just a path people had gotten used to. Walking dogs. Jogging. Occasionally driving through instead of taking the longer way around. I had seen them do it. I never said anything. I didn't mind. But legally, that wasn't kindness. That was tolerance. And tolerance does not equal permission. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The HOA hadn't secured access because they never thought they needed to. They assumed the land would always be there, always open, always available. They assumed no one would question it. And now, the same people who had quietly used my land for free were sending me a bill. That irony sat heavy in my chest. I kept reading. State law was clear. Without a recorded easement or written agreement, access across private land could be revoked at any time. No notice required, as long as it didn't violate emergency access laws. And here's the part that made my jaw tighten. If I blocked that shortcut, it wouldn't just inconvenience one or two people. It would affect dozens. Morning commutes would be longer. Emergency response routes would change. Daily routines would be disrupted. Suddenly, that $300 invoice didn't feel like leverage anymore. Felt like a mistake. I realized something important right then. The HOA wasn't charging me because they were strong. They were charging me because they were exposed. They needed my compliance more than I needed their approval. And the moment they tried to force payment, they showed their hand. I printed everything. Maps, statutes, property records. I organized it into a folder, clean and simple. Not to threaten, not to brag, just to be ready. Because at this point, I knew what was coming next. They weren't going to back down quietly. People who rely on assumption rarely do. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got another message. But this one wasn't an invoice. It was an invitation. The HOA board wanted to discuss the situation in person. That wording mattered. They didn't say enforce. They didn't say collect. They said discuss. I smiled for the first time since this whole thing started. Because discussions only happen when certainty disappears. I agreed to the meeting, not because I wanted to negotiate, but because I wanted to watch the moment they realized something they couldn't undo. I showed up early on the day of the meeting. The room was small, neutral, long table, folding chairs, the kind of place where decisions are made quietly and recorded in minutes no one reads. Board members trickled in, greeting me with polite smiles, friendly voices, calm expressions. They looked confident. They had no idea that confidence was about to evaporate. When everyone was seated, the conversation started just like I expected. They talked about community, about cooperation, about shared responsibility. Then they brought up the fee. That's when I placed the folder on the table. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. The room went quiet for a second. I opened the folder and slid the first document forward. A county map, then another, and another. Finally, I looked up and asked a question so simple it couldn't be dodged. Can you show me where your easement is recorded? No one answered. They glanced at each other, shifted in their seats. One of them cleared their throat and said something about long-standing use. I nodded. Then I said, calmly, long-standing use isn't legal access. The air changed. I could feel it. That was the moment they realized this meeting wasn't about collecting money anymore. It was about damage control. Because now they weren't just defending a fee. They were defending access they never legally owned. And I hadn't even mentioned the gate yet. The silence after my question didn't feel awkward. Felt heavy. You know that moment when a room realizes it's not in control anymore, but no one wants to be the first to admit it? That's exactly what it felt like. The HOA board members avoided eye contact. Papers rustled. Someone adjusted their chair like that might somehow change the situation. I stayed quiet. Silence can be uncomfortable, but it's also revealing. The longer it stretched, the clearer it became that no one in that room could answer the question I had asked. Finally, one of them spoke. He said something about how residents had been using that path for years. How it had become part of the neighborhood's daily life. How no one had ever objected before. I listened. I nodded. I let him finish. Then I said, calmly, habit doesn't create legal rights. That sentence landed harder than I expected. Another board member jumped in, trying to reframe the issue. She talked about cooperation, about working together, about how the HOA was just trying to be fair. Fair. That word gets thrown around a lot when power is slipping. I opened the folder again and slid another document forward. This one was a highlighted section of state property law. The part that explained easements clearly and without emotion. No recorded easement means no guaranteed access. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse them of anything. I simply read the words as they were written. The mood changed instantly. What had started as a casual meeting now felt like a negotiation neither side had planned for. One of the board members leaned forward and asked, "So what are you saying?" I took a breath. "I'm saying that I don't owe this fee. And I'm saying that the assumption of access across my land isn't supported by law." That was the moment when the conversation stopped being theoretical. Because now they had to confront the implications. They asked if I was threatening to block access. I shook my head. I'm not threatening anything. I'm explaining reality. Reality is a strange thing. You can ignore it for years, but when it finally